Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Stewart. I am the Director of Education here at the OI Foundation. I want to welcome you all to today's session, which is going to be a COVID-19 vaccine Q&A. We are very excited for today's session and all of the very important information we're going to be sharing. I want to go over a few rules of the road before we get started. First of all, you'll probably notice we have muted everyone's microphones. This is so that we can best hear the speakers presenting and get all the information we can, and also to cut down on background noise. We've all been probably in those teleconferences at this point where it's just you can't get through it. So we appreciate your patience there. Also, I wanted to remind everyone, so like past public Zoom calls we've done at the OIF, we want to remind everyone, this is not telemedicine. So while the speakers can answer questions on a wide variety of topics, they cannot and will not answer specific medical questions. So if you have further questions, we please encourage you to speak to your local physicians. Also, I wanted to let everyone know that this is planned to run approximately 1 hour, but we may run a little bit over depending upon how the discussion and questions go. If you have questions at any time throughout the call, please feel free to put them into the chat bar, and we'll get to them as soon as you can. Also, if you go to closed captions, you'll have we have a live closed captioner throughout the entire session today. Also, today's session will be recorded and posted live be recorded and posted onto our YouTube channel afterwards in the next few days. And we appreciate if you could check it out there. So with all this being said, I want to kind of get basically straight into it. So I want to introduce our speakers for today. So joining us, we have 3 panelists. We have Dr. Maria Elena Bottazzi, who Dr. Lee will be introducing more thoroughly in just a moment. But also we have Dr. Brendan Lee, who is at Baylor College of Medicine and also the lead investigator, or the principal investigator of the Brittle Bone Disease Consortium. And we also have Robert Sandhaus, another member of the OIF's Medical Advisory Council, who is a pulmonologist at National Jewish Health. So with that being said, I want to hand it off to Dr. Lee.
Thank you, Michael. Well, welcome everyone. We're delighted you're able to join us. I'm really honored to be able to bring and introduce Dr. Maria Elena Bottazzi. Dr. Bottazzi is currently the Associate Dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine and a Professor of Pediatrics and Co-Director of Texas Children's Center for Vaccine Development at Baylor College of Medicine. She is really the driving force of much of what's happening in vaccine development and a partner of Dr. Hotez, Peter Hotez, who I'm sure many of you have heard from in the press. They together have been driving another important vaccine for COVID, and she is really the international leader in this area. She co-chairs the new Vaccines and Therapeutics Workforce for the Lancet Commission on COVID-19, as well as a variety of other important committees, and she will be presenting sort of some background information, and then really will be leading us in this Q&A in this important area. Dr. Bottazzi?
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee, and thank you very much to the entire consortium and all of you who are listening. I'm going to do some very brief remarks to maybe put a framework, and then I know what we all want is to really go through some of the Q&A. So I'm going to share my screen and use some graphics so that you can at least get yourself familiarized with the topic. I believe everybody can see my slide deck, correct?
Yes.
Great. Some disclaimer, as I think Dr. Lee mentioned, I am inventor of many other vaccines, especially neglected tropical disease vaccines, but we currently have a COVID-19 vaccine that has now been non-exclusively licensed to an India-based vaccine manufacturer. And in fact, we are in phase 1, phase 2 clinical trials. So the way that I'd like to start is actually giving you already the punchline of our conversation, using a framework of why, and I think this is probably one of the greatest questions, is why has this endeavor of developing a COVID-19 vaccine done in such an accelerated timeline, and to indeed put to rest maybe some concerns that you think that because you do things fast, you also not do things with safety or with ethics, or of course with the right process, which I'm going to try to make sure that I'm clear that that's not the case. And I'm going to then clarify of the why, because of the different pillars that, of course, we have to take into consideration when you develop vaccines, or any biologic or any medicine. So the reason why we have been able to really move the needle so quickly, and having a COVID-19, which mostly imminently will be starting to get deployed later this month with the correct approvals, is the fact that we knew about coronaviruses for the most part 10, 15 years already. And I think we at some level have been very lucky that, amongst the viruses the virus that is causing this COVID-19 disease, it's of the family of the SARS coronaviruses, and that it's actually very similar to the coronavirus that caused the outbreak in the early 2000s. In fact, 80% similar when you look at its genetic code. And the fact that we actually found out about the sequence of this new virus, which is the SARS-2 virus, has been amazing, because very rapidly we knew that it was a SARS-like, right? And therefore, all the work that everybody had been doing related to SARS, I honestly tell you, has been applicable almost to the T to be used to leverage and accelerate the SARS-2 activities, including the fact, and in fact, this is not only for SARS, but also for the MERS type of coronaviruses, we already knew the soft target of this virus. We already know what the Achilles heel of this virus is, which is this so-called spike protein. So no one had to start from even kind of scratching its head of, I don't even know what this virus is. We don't even know what to target. How can we, destroy it? Because the fact that it was a coronavirus, that it was a SARS-like virus, we already knew that everybody should be targeting the spike protein. And if you look at this, in fact, all the vaccine activities target or the entire spike, or the spike within, of course, a vector or a whole virus, or pieces of that spike protein. So I think we've definitely lucked out. Another reason why, of course, we could accelerate is even 10, 20 years ago, the technologies that we use now are much more advanced in all levels, in the areas of genomics, in the areas of proteomics, in the areas of transcriptomics, all these so-called omics, which are really the pillars that helps us scientists move these technologies of how do you even make or evaluate platforms. And most importantly, sometimes people then say, well, true, you can make the product, and people tend to not really even pay too much attention of the actual production pillar. Everybody is, of course, very aware of the phases of evaluation, which are the preclinical and clinical phases. But even within the clinical phases, even though, of course, it's been terrible to have so much virus circulating and so much infection and so many people being not only infected but diseased, the reason why we have so much virus circulating, it allowed the trialists, the physicians that prepare the protocols for clinical trials, that they could overlap, do phase 1 with phase 2, do phase 2 with phase 3, and therefore you can maximize some of the vaccine safety evaluation and certainly the efficacy evaluation. And I think the last piece that also has helped in accelerating such a timeline is the fact that normally, especially those who invest in manufacturing, making large scale inventory of the vaccines, don't do this at risk. They already develop the manufacturing when they already know that the products work and that they're safe, because it's a lot of money that they need to invest. And everybody who now has been working on COVID-19 have advanced this manufacturing, meaning that they prepared large lots even if they don't even know whether they're going to work, with the risk that they possibly could even lose that manufacturing lots and lose all the money. And lastly, of course, is because all of us, including our agencies, including all the experts, are putting dedicated time and dedicated focus to be able to focus on this great problem. So again, production is taken care of, evaluation is taken care of, but I think that I'm going to go a little bit more deep also in this concept of delivery and affordability and equitably, and who can use these vaccines, who will probably be phased into the delivery, and a little bit of additional information for you on that note. I just want to also clarify that because we most likely all are hearing that the 2 vaccines that will be most prominently authorized pretty soon rely on this RNA technology, I just want to also clarify that this is indeed a novel technology. We have not used RNA vaccines in prior licensed medicines, but we have been working on RNA for quite some time. And one thing that we know is that the piece of this genetic code is packaged in a way that, of course, is suitable to use in immunizations with humans. We have some challenges in the cold chain. I think we all been hearing that you have to store these vaccines at some deep freezing temperatures. But once it enters into your body, it enters into our cells, and it uses our machinery to produce, again, the target, which is this protein, which is this spike protein. There is to date no evidence that these types of molecules do any harm genetically. They don't integrate into your body. They produce the protein, and then there's nothing that remains as a residual. Of course, they're new. We're going to see more and more how they behave. But we believe that they probably are going to be the next generation of how we can even make vaccines for other diseases in addition to COVID-19. This is just also to recap my representation of that concept of why vaccine clinical trials were able to be merged. And is, again, there's a lot of information in the Operation Warp Speed website, and which tells you, again, very specifically the fact that things were not skipped, but things were actually either merged or superimposed or done in not sequential manner, but actually consolidating and reducing the time slots of the efficiencies, but not necessarily removing the safety checks or removing the ethics or the rigorness of the data. I'm going to use, of course, then the Moderna and Pfizer as an example. This is a representation so that you can compare and contrast. And I think the distinction really is, again, how they will be presented mostly for use of the pharmacy who's going to deliver. If you receive a 10-dose vial or receive a 5-dose vial, if there's going to be any manipulation in the pharmacy before you receive it. Maybe some information that, it's usually you as a user may not necessarily really need to pay attention to, but we, of course, scientists, we are very eager to understand. For you, it's important to note that they're both 2-dose series, so 2 immunizations. The difference is one is after 28 days is the second, the Pfizer is after 21 days. We know that there is this storage freezing consideration. But at the same time, we also know that both have been evaluated in large cohorts of individuals, 30,000 for Moderna, 43,000 plus, for the Pfizer. And I think importantly here is also the age range, right? That, the Pfizer is going a little bit lower than 18 years of age, and also a little bit higher than the traditional 65 years of age or 55 years of age, which is important, of course, for understanding who will receive this vaccine. There's been very little published peer-reviewed information about the phase 3 trials yet. but we have some inference of the information about safety and efficacy based on some press releases. But the good news is that even though we may just see what is out there in the press releases or even in the websites of these companies, I can assure you, especially the US FDA does primary review of the primary data. I think that's, for example, if you hear about the fact that the United Kingdom already gave authorized approval for the Pfizer, the distinction of how the regulatory bodies review the information in countries such as the UK is that they rely on reviewing on the basis of the rolling information provided by the companies versus the United States FDA. They review the data that the company provides, but they request all the raw data, and then they do their own assessment of the primary data. And I think that's important because our US FDA is quite rigorous. It's probably one of the most respected regulatory agencies, together, of course, with the European, and certainly other regions of the world. But our agency has put some very key guidelines of how they review, especially in the context of the emergency. The same for Moderna, so I'm going to skip that. Just to make it clear also, what is this concept of emergency use versus getting a license for use? So again, we've actually never used an emergency use authorization for a vaccine before. It's a mechanism that it's supposed to be amenable for public health emergencies, which, as you know, we are. And it's considered and it's used if indeed there is the ability of having to treat or prevent something that is very life-threatening, as of course COVID-19 is. Most of the times when they review and they authorize for EUA, they already know that the product has a pathway to licensure, meaning that therefore the company has to continue the process and eventually they will be granted licensure. But in the meantime, they may say, do A, B, C, D, and E, but in the meantime, we will provide you with an approval. And that's why the approval is probably going to be very limited, very indicating exactly how this approval will be used. And here comes where there's been a lot of discussion about how are we going to allocate these vaccines and who is going to make the decision of how to create these delivery decisions. And there's one committee that works very closely, of course, with the US FDA, which is part of the CDC, which is the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. And they've been putting out, of course, a lot of announcements. They've been pre-meeting. And in fact, we know now that they're going to have a meeting December 10 to specifically look at the Pfizer vaccine dossier and provide suggestions and recommendations to the FDA. And on December 17, they'll do the same exercise for the Moderna vaccine. These committees are also been meeting to decide this concept of proposed allocation and how they're going to be phasing in the delivery on the basis of course, the data, the safety data, the efficacy data, and the availability of the doses, and who can manage the manipulations in the pharmacies and who can manage the storage. So for example, Texas has been selected one of these sites, and I know all our organizations in the medical center have been responding to register, to provide evidence that they could manage the allocation and that they would abide by the recommendations that come from these agencies, including, for example, every governor is also going to provide guidelines of how to work in each of the given states. It may be that each state may modify a little bit the guidelines, but ultimately it's being done in a framework of what not only the CDC through the Committee in Immunization Practices recommendations, and ultimately also how the US FDA is going to grant these permissions. I'm going to then finish so that we can open to some discussion to the fact that we're just starting this process. I know it feels like it's been forever, but we have certainly some knowns. We know that the vaccines that have been evaluated have been evaluated to try to see how they could prevent disease and how we can even boost individuals who may have been previously exposed to the virus. We also know that most likely individuals with rare genetic diseases, as long as they may not have an impact in their immunological function, prior vaccines have never shown that there have been any contraindications. So we're hopeful that when the CDC and these committees come out with recommendations, it will mirror pretty much how other vaccine contraindications have been set up. However, what we still do not know is how long is going to be the duration of the immunity conferred by these vaccines. So most likely there are going to be more clinical trials, and we are going to also have to wait, as I mentioned, that even though these groups that have been in clinical trials are still going to be evaluated probably for even beyond a year to show how the vaccine immunity is durable. We definitely have no studies in children below the 12 years of age, and therefore likely there will not be an indication of any of these initial vaccines for children. We also know there has been no studies in pregnant women, for example, and even elders above the ages of 85 years old. My dad, for example, is 88 and most likely will not be able to even qualify for any of these vaccines. And the other piece, again, because these vaccines were evaluated first to look at the impact on preventing or ameliorating the severity of the COVID-19 disease, we still do not know how well these vaccines can interrupt the spread or the transmission of the virus. So still a bit of unknowns. I think I am going to stop there. Thank you. Remind everybody that ultimately the reason why we think that any of the vaccines that will be authorized, and if indeed you are eligible, they followed a very rigorous process. The benefit of getting a vaccine will definitely outweigh the risk and the Russian roulette that we're playing today with not knowing whether if you do get infected, you may get severe disease. We have to trust science. We have to trust the process. Of course, trust your doctors, but we still have to be patient. And we have to remain vigilant because I know that cases are surging, and with all these holidays and the fact that we're all very fatigued, we should not lose the sight that this has definitely been a very serious disease, and we need to maintain distance, and we're probably using masks probably for quite a while. So sending it back to the team and opening it up for the discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Bottazzi. So now we're going to transition to some of our pre-prepared audience questions. So I'm just going to pull up some slides.
Can I ask you, do you see hear a lot of feedback? Because if not, I'm going to go close my door from my side. Do you hear any noise behind me?
Sounds good to me, yeah.
Okay, good, thank you.
If anyone is having any problems hearing, please type it into the chat and we'll try to address it later. So I'm going to share these slides. Do you all see that?
Yes.
Sounds good. Let me just flip this. Cool. So we've picked roughly a dozen questions already, and we were trying to hit questions that fell into larger themes that covered many other people's questions as well. So if you look closely, you may see yours here. So first question is, who will be able to get a vaccine first, and how do I get in line for it? So I know part of this was answered, but I'm going to give you all the floor.
As Dr. Bottazzi pointed out, there's broad guidelines from the CDC, but then each state implements that guideline according to their interpretation of what the most risky populations are and how to distribute to them. So what we answer to this question may not apply exactly to your state, but the main goal of the prioritization is to get a vaccine to healthcare workers, to frontline personnel and essential personnel, and to people living in long-term care facilities. That seems to be the major thrust of the first wave of the vaccines that are out there. And then each subsequent wave of vaccinations will go to people that are at slightly lower risk. Maybe they're only elderly. They don't have other underlying conditions, or people that just have underlying conditions but aren't elderly. And then eventually the goal is to get the entire population vaccinated. And the speed of that kind of wave over the general population is a function of production of vaccine and acceptance of the vaccine by the general population.
I can maybe add a little extra, which again, I think the intent is to cover those who are really at the front lines, because we know that in fact, we've seen it, because I sit in the task force of Texas Children's as a hospital, right, a hospital system. Most of the people don't acquire the infection within the hospital, but it's brought in from the community. So what we need to do is protect those who attend to the people who come to seek for healthcare in our hospitals, so that the frontliners don't actually get infected themselves, so that they can treat and certainly provide good clinical care to the community. And I think probably the other big targeted population is, again, those who provide healthcare out in the field, meaning the EMTs, the ambulance workers, those who work in the elderly facilities, and then most likely also who provide services, right? Those who are out some of us may be privileged that we can call and have the food delivered to us, or those who are preparing the food, because again, the transmission is in the community, but when you have the disease, you come into these healthcare locations, and we need to make sure that those who serve our communities to treat and to take care of them, they also get protected.
Perhaps I would add that regarding the second part of that, how do I get in line for it? As Dr. Bottazzi mentioned, this is not something, at least initially, that you just go to your private community doctor to get. There are organizations that have the ability to store and distribute will be the ones that will facilitate the distribution. And that may vary. Certainly major hospitals are doing it. And obviously already we've heard some of the major pharmacy chains are involved, but it's not something where like you just go to your regular doctor to get it, at least initially.
For instance, CVS has said that they're going to devote their distribution of initial vaccine to getting it to nursing home personnel, both patients and workers. And they're going to be their main concentration initially.
Another example is, I think, as you noted, the way that these companies, Moderna and Pfizer, are shipping the containers and the way that the doses are in these boxes. You noted that, for example, the Pfizer ships in larger inventory. It has much more complicated temperature chain requirements. So those likely will end up in large healthcare centers, and the smaller healthcare facilities will probably receive the Moderna vaccine because it's less complicated to manipulate, and therefore can also be dispensed because it comes in smaller multi-dose vials. I think to also clarify, I think we should not worry about, is it the Moderna that I'm getting? Is it the Pfizer that I'm getting? I think all scientists are coming to their realization, as I mentioned at the beginning, is I have a feeling that all vaccines will work, all vaccines will be safe. We just need to make sure that they're evaluated, and that the guidelines to say this vaccine is better suited for these types of people and these types of demographics and these types of locations. These other vaccines are better suited for this. And most likely, eventually, we're going to even see second and even third generations of vaccines. Right now, the most important is if you qualify, we think that it's of much better benefit to get it because you're really protecting yourself against severe disease.
Great, thank you. So what do we know about the vaccines in regards to children, those who are pregnant, and the elderly?
Maybe I'll reiterate that we know nothing about vaccines in children below the ages of 12. We definitely have no studies in pregnant women. I do know that at least for pregnant women, we already have, I've been invited to sit in a conversation with some of the agencies that are already looking to design those types of studies to try to incentivize these companies to provide interest in expanding their clinical trial evaluation. Most likely the same will happen where they're going to de-escalate the clinical trials in children. It's very unlikely that they're just going to extrapolate. They're probably going to want to do clinical trials as normally it's done, where from an adult trial, you then do studies in de-escalated age ranges. And I think for the elderly, we already have some interesting, most likely information. Of course, we scientists haven't seen the published data or a lot of published data, and most likely we will see an expansion of elderly studies too, looking more or less at also how do you improve the formulation. We, as an example, we know the flu vaccine, there is a flu vaccine that is specifically produced and formulated for elderly use compared to the flu vaccine that is used for other types of populations. So most likely we will see also additional studies.
Great, thank you. Any other comments, or should I move on?
Move on.
Okay. So are there resources for people to find out whether they can get a vaccine? And like, who do I reach out to? Who do I talk to see if I can get one?
Well, that would be your state health departments, because that's who's going to be managing the distribution of vaccines in each individual state. So most places have a, colorado.gov or something.gov website, and you go to the health department, and there's usually a lot of COVID resources there already that you might already be approaching, but that's where most states are planning on having the information about accessing the virus and documenting that you've received the virus, things along those lines.
Yes, I agree. And in fact, today I was even seeing that there's going to be some very interesting way of how they're going to be tracking the safety after the initial individual will start getting vaccinated. There's probably going to be an app that people are going to start to use, which is all going to be consolidated and eventually rolled up to being managed by certainly the CDC. Because remember, from state, for example, in Texas, we also have the state, then we have the cities. So there's, so there's going to be all these rolling up of the information, but you can start with even just looking at who in your district is managing, the health, and it can be your city's health department or your state health department.
And if you have an academic medical center near you, or obviously one in your state, you could call their COVID resource line or something along those lines, and they can direct you to the right location.
Correct.
Great, thank you. So this next question is about, so Dr. Bottazzi, you were talking about Project Warp Speed and also how these were produced very quickly. To my knowledge, quicker than any vaccines in human history. Will this affect the safety of these vaccines or the long-term effects in any way that we know?
And as I indeed gave you the punchline from the beginning, I think that that's one thing that we would really like to stress and reassure. And I know that sometimes it's doing a disservice of using terminologies like warp speed that feels like, you know, you're doing things in a haste, or you're doing things, you know, without putting the appropriate checks and balances. But, you know, we really have to say that certainly all our agencies have really stepped up. They have been quite transparent. I mean, the FDA has put out some very, very, very strict guidelines guiding these companies of how they should even design their studies. It's actually even been a little bit unprecedented that we have seen, albeit through press releases, even the disclosure of the blueprints. So so now you can even find how the original clinical trial design of Pfizer and Moderna was. And you know, arguably we can improve this. We could have improved a little bit the communication, make it a little bit clearer, so that we can remove this hesitance and this confidence factor. But at least me as an individual, I value the process, and because I know how complex and how arduous it is, I think we have done a pretty good job all over the world, I have to say, not only in the United States.
I would add,
go ahead, Brad.
in the context of these two messenger RNA vaccines. So while that may sound, it's true that no messenger RNA vaccine has ever been approved and used. The messenger RNAs themselves have been studied for decades, and in fact, there is a previous approved RNA-based therapy. So even that is not completely new. And certainly there have been many animal studies with regards to messenger RNA approaches in different contexts, not necessarily vaccines. But I think it's important to underscore it's not as if messenger RNA itself is something that's new. This is an application that's new for vaccines, but they've been studied in this context in certainly animal models and other circumstances for years.
Two quick points. Number one, we've been concentrating on the messenger RNA viruses because they're the ones that will probably be available in the US first, but there are other more standard and some novel vaccine technologies that are also moving forward. And the other thing I would say is that for the kinds of side effects that viruses have had, that vaccines have had over the years, even with these 2-year, 3-year development plans that those vaccines have had to undergo, there have been side effects that have shown up because they're so infrequent that you don't hear about them until the vaccine has been used for a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. Some of those are so rare that some of the side effects attributed to the vaccine may not even be attributable to the vaccine. They may be just the happenstance of having had a vaccine and then someone gets a rare condition. There have been cases, you know, like the swine flu, vaccine, where there have been, for instance, neurologic side effects that only appeared after enough people had gotten the vaccine. Millions of people had gotten the vaccine. And they're not going to be found in the kinds of trials that we're doing now. They're not going to be found even sometimes in the standard vaccine development process over a number of years. And I know people don't like to hear this, but that's part of the risk-benefit analysis of vaccine administration, that a vaccine that saves thousands and thousands of lives may have a side effect that will harm an individual out of millions of people receiving the vaccine. And you hear about those because the news likes to focus on those sometimes. Yeah. But the fact is, the risk-benefit calculation, if you will, to put it coldly, for vaccines has always favored the administration of vaccines. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And in fact, we can go back hundreds of years, even when Jenner created the first vaccine, which, imagine at those ages, it was such a crude formulation, right? A crude vaccine. And even with those and with the lack of all the technologies and certainly what we know now and the controls and everything, it saved millions of lives. And I think that that's the value of vaccines. Definitely have always been the best public health intervention that we've seen, around the world.
I think it's important to not lose sight of the context. Side effects can occur in any medicines, almost, I would say, every medicine that we take, including Tylenol. And the reality is that the benefits outweigh those risks so much that we don't even think about it. And I think it's important to approach vaccines the same way.
Right.
Great, thank you all so much. I'll move on to the next question, which in my mind I view as related. And this is a question the OIF gets all the time. People in my own life ask me this type of question all the time. Would it be wise to wait for more people in the general population to take it, meaning the vaccine, first to see how they react? Another way to phrase this is, should we wait to see what happens with other people first?
Well, in my mind, I would say no, because what you're going to have to wait probably, like we heard before, before millions and millions of people, to see whether there's that 1% or maybe one adverse event that is going to happen that may apply to us or not. I think certainly what you do have to, of course, be mindful is that right now, maybe when you're saying should we wait, is the likelihood is that you're going to have to wait, because the way that these vaccines will be rolled out is not like tomorrow they approve and then you can stand in line and get it, because it's going to be this phased approach. So most likely, most of us, unless you are of course a front line healthcare that is really providing clinical care, we are going to probably have to wait maybe even up to next spring. But I don't think that there's anything in certainly the evidence right now of what we've seen about the safety and what we've seen of how these vaccines work that merit you standing by and waiting. That certainly, however, should be a discussion between also you and your doctor on the basis of, again, what these vaccines will be approved for. And if you do have some underlying condition or a risk factor, I'm sure when they gave these recommendations, we will see a little bit better of what are going to be the contraindications, if any, or any kind of guidelines of who and how should use these vaccines.
Thank you. I think that's super clear. So I'm going to move on then. If COVID-19 mutates, will these vaccines still be viable? And I guess in that discussion is these discussions of these different types of vaccines as well.
Correct. And so when I mentioned to you all that this virus, the SARS-2 virus, is from the SARS-like families, and it's even 80% similar to the one we had prior. For example, and this is certainly preclinically, because we have been working even with SARS vaccines. We know, for example, that when we immunize a SARS vaccine, it can cross-neutralize SARS-2, and we've also shown in our laboratories that if you immunize with a SARS-2 vaccine, it can even cross-neutralize the SARS-1 virus. So even if it's 80% similar. So probably, I think in the future, in fact, what I think all of us are going to be striving towards is even looking for what we call universal coronavirus vaccines, and even predict potentially even COVID 21, 26, 2030, right? To see, if we have something available. If you also look at today, how the virus is actually mutating, because as you know, everything mutates, even us humans mutate, right? All living beings mutate. We are very lucky that the rate of genetic drift and the rate of mutation of this virus is not very rampant. Not, for example, as you see the flu virus recombining and creating different strains, or an HIV/AIDS virus that clearly also mutates, has a very high rate of mutations. So However, these mutations that we're seeing in the COVID-19 virus, fortunately, is not occurring very much in that spike protein. And those that occur within the spike protein are not in the area of the spike protein that we know it's key for the protein to serve its function. Therefore, most of the vaccines will likely be viable, at least for the years to come. That said, that doesn't mean that we should all say, oh, that's it, therefore let's not work on this anymore. We scientists always look for, in the event that, therefore we are also looking for how to improve in case we do need to supplement or generate new formulations or new generations of these vaccines.
I would add also that while so much resources have been put in developing vaccines, there's a lot of science going on to study the evolution and the biology of the virus, so that, in the event, I mean, there, as Dr. Bottazzi said, there will be mutations. And if there were a mutation that would escape the current vaccines, I think we are actually very well positioned to tackle that because of the investment that we are in right now. So I think there's reason for optimism in spite of the fact that there, invariably will be mutations.
Got it. Thank you. So should we still get the vaccine even if we recently had and recovered from COVID-19? And I guess the word recently could either stay or be taken out of this question.
Yes, and I believe we will certainly have to wait for the final guidelines, but as per what I have been hearing scientifically, because of the type of immune response that an individual gets when it's naturally infected, meaning when the person sees the natural virus, we believe that most likely, even if you had the disease or if you were asymptomatic, you are going to get the vaccine. The other reason is we know safety-wise that it's not going to be deleterious. In fact, it's actually probably going to be a booster. So you may even be have a higher level of protection because you're also recalling, the fact that you've already been exposed to the virus. Third, even though it may not be necessarily that important, is logistically, it's also going to be much easier rather than saying, oh, we have to screen everybody and say, oh, have you been infected? Or have you been infected before giving the vaccine? That is going to probably logistically not be very feasible to do. And so I think, again, we scientifically have been very lucky that we are not going to have to worry that if somebody has had the vaccine, the virus before, that most likely already have had an immune response that is going to prevent this individual of getting the vaccine.
Great, thank you. So this is about the vaccines, and many of them have 2 shots, or at least it seems like the big 3 that have been in the news recently, AstraZeneca, Moderna, Pfizer. So they require 2 shots, which is not that uncommon, but I'm curious about, is this the same shot or different treatments that you're getting? And like what level, so we have written here, what is the likelihood someone getting COVID-19 between the 2 shots of their vaccination? But I guess another way to phrase that again is, what coverage are you getting when you've gotten the first, but not the second one? Is it like, hey, is it 50-50? Is it, oh, you're 90% of the way there, but still don't do anything reckless? Well, what's that in-between period like?
So first, the question of, is it the same shot of different treatments? No. So if, for example, if you start and you were assigned to receive the Pfizer vaccine, the 2 shots will be the same vaccine. They're not going to give you 1 Pfizer and 1 Moderna to complete the regimen. You're going to, you're definitely going to complete the same regimen with the same vaccine. The gap between receiving the first dose and the second dose, as we saw, it's either 21 days or 28 days. Of course, there's always the likelihood that you can get exposed to the infection between those 21 days and 28 days. But your body, once you receive the vaccine, most likely will start mounting the immune response, which I believe it's clearly happening during the first couple of weeks. So probably you're already having protection, while eventually then you get the booster, which is that second dose, so that you can then, the booster is also a concept where you're also building more of what we call the cells that will remain as your memory. So therefore it also allows you to build your immune response to prepare for the long term. But I believe that you probably will already have a response that is likely going to also protect you in between the two gaps. Clearly, we do need to see some of that data. I think that's, again, one of those informations that have not been very clear from the press release announcements. When we hopefully will see certainly the publications of these large trials, we will know with more detail. But even looking at some of the phase 1, phase 2 trials, and honestly, even looking at when they did all the preclinical animal model studies, we already had an indication of how good 1 dose versus 2 doses work. The reason why, therefore, however, all of them are striving for the 2-dose shot is because we know that due to the amount of burden of the virus that it's circulating, the fact that we actually have so much virus in the community, that you really need a very robust response. And that's another thing that also we probably very soon will hopefully decipher is, indeed, are we going to have a surrogate, meaning or a number that says, if you have more than this amount of neutralizing antibodies, you therefore definitely have protection, and even potentially even say this leads into the memory. Those are also some responses that we're still trying to investigate. And and to add to that is, that said, there's also the other side of the coin. It may be well that, even after you receive these 2 shots, we find out that the memory is still not very durable, and you may see that it may be that we are going to be asked to come back and receive a 3rd shot that would actually really boost it to the point where then we can do long-term memory. Michael, you had a question?
Well,
or somebody had a question.
Yeah, I was going to say, today in the New England Journal, Moderna reported its results based on data from their phase 1 and phase 2 trials on the persistence of and levels of antibody that were produced and measured by various ways. And they showed persistence of very high titers out through 119 days, which puts them after the first shot, which puts it 90 days after the second shot. Mm-hmm. And they said that soon they'll be reporting the results of the analysis for the memory cells for this. And they also, one other aspect of that report was they did show that the older you were, the less dramatic the rise in antibody levels. But on the other hand, even in the oldest participants, the antibody levels were considerably higher than are seen in people who've had a COVID-19 infection that they've recovered from. Mm-hmm. So it's the first inklings of good news about persistence of the antibody treatment. Interestingly, that they looked at the antibodies between the first and the second dose, and as expected, it was a much smaller antibody response during that first 28 days, and then a dramatic peak when that persisted after the second injection.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Keeping this issue also in the context and what we know in history, it's oftentimes, though, that we have to get booster vaccines. Many of the vaccines we have, especially as we get older. So I think the question, of course, is if that were to be the case, how long would it be? Would it be 1 year, 5 years, 10 years? And that obviously is something that only studies will tell. But, again, this is all very much par for the course, given the, many, many years of history of vaccine development in science.
It's very rare that we have vaccines with just a single shot. You know, most of them are either you do a single shot, but then of course you have to do it every year, like the flu, because it changes every year, or you have vaccines like Shingrix, which are 2 doses, or hepatitis B, which are 3 doses.
Great, thank you. So could there be any problems for patients receiving the vaccine who have an autoimmune disorder?
So I'm not a physician. Maybe I will transfer over this question to one of my colleagues in the panel. Again, I think until we don't see certainly any contraindications, maybe you all can clarify how usually this happens in the normal standard immunizations.
Sandy, do you want to take that, or you want
Sure.
me to?
I mean, it's kind of a double-edged question. I'll add to the question, people with autoimmune disorders and people who have immune disorders. So people with autoimmune disorders, such as lupus and certain kinds of arthritis and that sort of thing, often make excellent responses to vaccines, and that probably should not be an issue. But whenever we say something like this, we have to qualify that by saying we won't know for sure until we actually look at an analysis of how people have done with those disorders who get a vaccine. Mm-hmm. But from a medical standpoint, there shouldn't be an issue with people with autoimmune disorders. If what you really mean is people that are immunodeficient or have an immune disorder or on medications that affect your immune response, such as transplant patients who might be on anti-rejection drugs, things like that, you'll notice that the CDC guidelines put those people in the high category of receiving the vaccine early. But the fact is, there has been very little done to this point to evaluate whether people that are unable to mount a good immune response will actually make an immune response or a good immune response to the vaccines that are available. So in other vaccines that are given to, for instance, transplant patients, they often have to have higher dose or additional injections of vaccine in order to mount the kind of immune response that will protect them. But we really don't have the answers to those specific questions yet.
Yeah, I would add that certainly the way Dr. Sandhaus distinguished immunodeficiency with autoimmune disorders, where your immune system is hyperactive, are different and should be considered differently. I think an important element to also emphasize is that individuals who have the classic autoimmune disorders like lupus or scleroderma or rheumatoid arthritis, you're often on immunosuppressant drugs. Those drugs will blunt your response to the vaccine. And so, in fact, that's important to keep in mind in this context.
Got it. Thank you. So I'll move on to our next question, which is actually, we're getting a lot of comments and questions in the chat that relate to this, which is about, so will the OI population or other rare disease communities, because we have other rare disease communities on this call, be eligible to receive the vaccination earlier as a high-risk population? So I know, Dr. Bottazzi, you talked about those like tiered, like I think it was A1 or like 1A, 1B, 1C, or can you speak up more on that?
Right, and I believe, again, right now there's been many different meetings and committees to try to determine what is included in the phase 1A, phase 1B, and phase 1C. And I would suggest that we should keep an eye. Eventually, I know that that Committee on Immunization Practices met and voted, indeed yesterday, I believe, on what these groups should include. Then this information is also transferred over to, again, the states, and they're going to probably even tweak it depending on what is applicable to the states. But right now it looks like the phase 1A are the healthcare providers and those who are in the elderly facilities. Then the phase 1B is going to include, add on the essential workers. Then in the phase 1C, they're going to include the adults with high-risk medical conditions and adults over 65. And then phase 2 will pretty much be a catch for all and everybody else. So the real question is, any of the populations that you are listing here, right, you know, of the OI population, does it happen that also fall within any of those categories? And therefore that would mean whether they can be eligible initially, or they're going to be added into the high risk population when it comes to B, which is practically, you know, the phase 1C and beyond. And phase 1C right now, it's looking like going to be around, I think like 15 or 20 weeks later after the first rollout. So that's probably going to be certainly, you know, March or April of next year.
So in the when the initial you know, proposal of the CDC guidelines for receiving vaccines came out, the OI Foundation submitted a letter to the CDC. Tracy, correct me if I'm wrong, asking that OI individuals be included in the higher risk categories. That was based on the fact that they were choosing a number of specific lung diseases and saying that they would be included in what was then the 1B and is now the 1C. Other organizations did the same that had a pulmonary component to their problems. In the final document, or the document that's the most recent, they've changed some of the specific naming of diseases like COPD and interstitial lung disease and things like that to saying people with chronic lung disease. And so while something like OI is not specifically mentioned in the guidance, it could reasonably be argued that OI individuals, because we know now that they have pulmonary problems as a prominent component to their illness, could be included in the chronic lung disease category. But it's unclear if there's a mechanism yet to say, I'm in this category, even though my disease or my condition isn't listed there. It'll probably be something that you would appeal to your state health department or something like that to say, I'm one of those health, you know, chronic lung conditions. As someone with OI, it'll probably take some education of those health authorities to explain why a bone disease gives you a pulmonary condition. But we're here to help you in those appeals if they're necessary to get that done. I certainly consider that people with OI should be in that in the 1C category, and I would be happy to help in convincing people. We'll probably prepare some letters that people can, it's generic letters that people can use when they want to appeal their status for the vaccine.
Certainly, you know, even in addition to what Dr. Sandhaus mentioned, many OI patients who are on more the severe end of the spectrum have clinical, you know, diagnosis of lung disease that's being managed. And so even in addition to the diagnosis of OI, you know, the presence of the fact that you may have a diagnosed managed lung disease would potentially put you in that category anyway. So certainly I think for those of you who are, you know, being followed for a pulmonary component already that's causing problems, and then again, there's good reason to try to advocate and position yourself for that.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm already seeing some people very much liking the idea of letters, Dr. Sandhaus. So I'm gonna move on to our actual final prepared question. So actually we are shockingly not very late. So once we receive the vaccine, will we be able to return to life pre-COVID, or will we still need to take precautions?
Well, as much as I wish I could say, sure, we can all return to our normal life, I have a feeling that it's going to take us quite a while to arrive to that, mostly because there's still so much virus that it's certainly being transmitted in our community. And before we can really reach what we call that balance of populations being protected through the vaccine use, and certainly based on the efficacy of the vaccine, we will probably need to have more than around 80% of probably even the entire world population to be vaccinated. So in the meantime, as we hope we can ramp up not only the initial delivery, eventually not only in the US, but certainly even abroad, we are going to have to probably reach that 80%. That's also because it's going to create what I believe most of you have probably already heard, this concept of herd immunity, right? Which is more and more people get vaccinated. Hopefully also more and more, we are going to reduce the transmission of the virus. And for instance, if indeed you are an individual who cannot get the vaccine because you don't mount a good immune response to the vaccine, but you're surrounded by a herd of your community that it's protected, and therefore the virus starts really, we're really reducing that virus circulating curve. That's when we eventually can take out using the mask as even the social distancing. I predict that this most likely would not happen before the end of 2021, because during the year of 2021 is when we hope we can see a lot of vaccine use, vaccine distribution. We will learn more about vaccination and the safety and efficacy. Remember, we know that a lot of the carriers are the pediatric populations or the younger generations. And therefore, since we're not really going to be able to use the vaccine in that population, we need to protect them also with different tools. And hopefully, starting 2022, we may be able to start seeing some more normality back to what we were. But there is optimism. I think we will tackle this virus. It's just now to ensure that we help people who may have some hesitance, certainly answer any questions that, make people question why they should use a vaccine. And ideally now the key is vaccines are no good unless we, of course, vaccinations are performed.
Right.
I would emphasize, I would emphasize that the unknown that Dr. Bottazzi noted in one of the slides, that while the vaccine is protective from you from getting sick or very ill, it may not protect transmission. You may still replicate the virus and give it to someone else. So I think having a mask will prevent that. And so there's every reason for you, even if you get the vaccine, to continue to wear the mask. And frankly, from a broader perspective outside of COVID, masks prevent infections and illness in general. And there are parts of the world where wearing a mask is socially acceptable. And, there's nothing wrong for it to be a fashionable statement longer term, because if you wear a mask, you will prevent yourself from other viruses, not just COVID. So I do think for many reasons, continuing to wear a mask is not only should be something we all should do.
Maria, do you want to just talk briefly about the rest of the world? I mean, we've been very US specific and very developed country specific, but we're not going to conquer this without vaccinating the world.
Yes, absolutely. And maybe there I can also make a little side note about our horse that we have in the game, in the race, if I may say. And the fact that indeed you also alerted that even beyond the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine, we also have other vaccines that also include other technologies, right? Protein-based vaccines, live virus, attenuated vaccines, or even viral vector vaccines. I'm sure you've heard about the AstraZeneca Oxford. There's a Sanofi GSK, there's a Novavax. Ours is actually done with a company called Biological E, which is an India-based company. In fact, there's a whole network all that are called the Developing Country Vaccine Manufacturing Network. that, to be honest, make probably 90–95% of all the vaccines that are being used around the world. That's again a concept that nowadays it's quite unique, that everybody's calling these vaccines by their nationalism. The Russia vaccine, the Chinese vaccine, the India vaccine, where to be honest, when you get your vaccines, you don't even know where it was produced, and in fact, even vaccines that we get in the US, not necessarily these multinationals have their factories in the US territory. They collaborate and they contribute by doing these manufacturing agreements. So in the rest of the world, the way that it's been managed is not like an Operation Warp Speed, but relatively a similar process, where there's a group of agencies, including the World Health Organization, the Global Alliance for Vaccines, which is called Gavi. There's actually a funding agency, which is called the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness, CEPI, who in fact, they've been preparing for a potential pandemic for quite a while. Maybe they didn't realize this would be a global pandemic, but that they have been helping a lot with Ebola and other infections. And these agencies together also put together a portfolio, which is a little bit broader than the portfolio from the US. The US Warp Speed has around 6 vaccines that are being considered. So Moderna, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca, Novavax, and Sanofi GSK. Those same 6 are, for the most part, also part of the global ecosystem, but then the global ecosystem has many more, because remember, we have the rest of the world to handle, right? Europe, Canada, but also the Africa, Latin America, Asia, Southeast Asia, Middle East. So we have a larger ecosystem. I think the challenge that they're facing is which, again, each agency has to give approvals. Like the US is giving their own approvals, the UK is giving approvals, the EU is giving approvals. So we're still having to figure out which ones will fall within the global ecosystem. And then, to be quite honest, they have an added layer of regulatory review, which is that World Health Organization pre-qualification review that will allow any of these global agencies and global manufacturers to be able to say, I made the vaccine in India, but I can ship it to Latin America, because Latin America cannot produce it and therefore has to buy it or receive it from another group. So we have many more, and in fact, probably even the Operation Warp Speed will eventually accept and collaborate with many of these other ones, probably even depending on the geopolitical situation, maybe even considering some vaccines from countries or producers from countries that may not necessarily be considered today. But we're going to have many more options also, most likely coming to the US, but also serving the rest of the world. And as you said, Dr. Sandhaus, to allow us to freely get on a plane and go visit, countries around the globe, visit our families around the world, we will need to ensure that we have vaccine use around the world and continue using these tools of distancing and certainly hygiene and mask wearing, probably all over.
Great. So it sounds like, even though I want to be able to get the vaccine tomorrow, recycle all my masks and be done with this, that is not going to be the reality. Dr. Bottazzi, I want to thank you so much for speaking with us this evening. We know you and your expertise are incredibly in demand right now, so we feel honored that you joined us this evening and to speak with us. Dr. Lee and Dr. Sandhaus, as always, it was great hearing from you and also hearing you share your wisdom and expertise with us as well. A quick sort of side note, so people were talking in the chat a little bit about the link between pulmonary function and OI. The OIF actually has a few fact sheets and resources about this very topic. we're going to be emailing everyone, so thank you for coming. We can share those in that email. Also, I earlier in the chat shared a evaluation link. This helps give us feedback on how to improve these in the future. Let me put it in the chat again for everyone. Oh, it looks like one of my colleagues beat me to it. If you have any questions, please go to oif.org or email us at bonelink@oif.org. Thank you all so much for joining.
There's been a good response to the issue of the generic letter. Where that will appear is on the foundation website. So we'll get that prepared and we'll get it on the website where the other information is, so that you can use that, hand it to your physician to sign it, modify it appropriately for you, and use that when you speak to the health authorities. Mm-hmm. We'll see how much good it does, but I think it's a step in the right direction.
And from my side, well, first of all, it's been a pleasure. I hope it was informative. Always willing to do a version 2.0 of the discussion. The field is moving certainly at pretty quick pace. We will know a lot more once we see the resolutions out of these evaluations and the emergency use authorizations that most likely are going to come out this month. And as we also see what's happening around the world, I think we're going to be able to probably even provide more information for the group.
Great. Thank you all so much, and have a good evening. Stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you, everyone.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.